Jake's truck kicked up a trail of dust as he drove down the desolate road toward the small town of Red Mesa, perched on the edge of the Navajo reservation. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the vast desert landscape. He hadn't been here in years, not since he was a kid visiting his uncle during summer breaks. Now, older, and with a thirst for something different, Jake had decided to spend a week with his relatives. He wasn't expecting anything special, just some peace and quiet away from the city. But the town had changed. Something felt off. Red Mesa was small, just a few scattered houses, a diner, a gas station, and the dry, unending desert that stretched out toward the reservation. As Jake pulled into his uncle's driveway, he couldn't shake the eerie quiet of the place. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the weight of the silence, like the town was holding its breath. That night, as Jake sat around the dinner table with his Uncle Henry and Cousin Maria, the conversation turned to the strange happenings in the area. "People are saying it's back," Henry muttered, barely looking up from his plate. His voice was low, as if speaking too loudly might draw its attention. "What's back?" Jake asked, curious. Henry exchanged a glance with Maria before leaning back in his chair. "The Skinwalker." Jake had heard the stories before. He remembered the tales as ghost stories told around campfires when he was a kid. Creatures that could shapeshift, evil beings that could become animals and humans alike. But those were just stories, right? Maria shuddered. "You think it's just a story, but things have been happening. Livestock disappearing, strange tracks around the town, and at night, there are screams coming from the desert. Not animals, but something else." Jake laughed nervously, brushing it off. "You guys are trying to freak me out. I'm not a kid anymore." His uncle didn't smile. "You'll see." Jake's first few nights in Red Mesa were unsettling. He couldn't sleep. Every night around 2 a.m. he heard it, strange howls echoing from the desert, far off but distinct. It wasn't the sound of coyotes or wolves. This was something more human, almost like a scream cut short. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the local wildlife, but the sound stuck with him, creeping into his thoughts during the day. The locals were no help. When Jake visited the diner, they whispered about the strange things that had been happening. People were locking their doors at night. Some refused to go out after dark. And then there were the disappearances. A few days before Jake arrived, one of the rancher's cows had been found mutilated, its body torn apart in ways no animal could manage. And just 2 nights ago, a local boy had vanished from his home, with only a set of strange, elongated tracks leading into the desert. "Tracks like a human, but wrong," an old man told Jake in the diner. "Too long, too thin." Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every time he walked through town or went to the outskirts near the desert, he felt eyes on him. One night he decided to take a walk, thinking some fresh air might calm his nerves. The town was quiet, the streets empty under the dim glow of the streetlights. As he reached the edge of town, where the last houses met the open desert, he froze. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the light, right where the town met the reservation land. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was tall, thin, and completely still. At first, Jake thought it was a person, but something about the way it stood was wrong, unnatural, like its limbs were too long for its body. "Hey!" Jake called out, taking a step toward it. The figure didn't move. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but as soon as he did, it bolted. It didn't run like a person, though. It loped on all fours, moving faster than anything he'd ever seen. Jake's heart raced, and he turned back toward his uncle's house, walking quickly, trying not to look over his shoulder. When he got home, he didn't tell his uncle what he saw. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he knew something was wrong. The next day, Jake decided to investigate. He drove out toward the desert, toward the area where the strange tracks had been found. The land out here was harsh and unforgiving. Vast stretches of scrub brush and jagged rocks, with deep ravines cutting through the earth. The further he drove, the more isolated he felt. There were no people, no animals, just the wind and the empty land stretching out for miles. Parking his truck near the Bright Angel trailhead, he got out and started walking. The sky was clear, but the air was heavy with an unshakable tension. After a while, he found them. Tracks. just like the ones people had been talking about. They were human-shaped, but longer, like someone had stretched the footprints out unnaturally. As he crouched down to get a closer look, a chill ran down his spine. There, in the distance, he heard the scream again, louder this time, closer. Jake stood up quickly, heart pounding, scanning the horizon. He was miles from town, alone in the desert. But he wasn't alone. Something was watching him. As night fell, Jake found himself running. He didn't know where, just away from the sound, away from the presence that seemed to follow him. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the jagged landscape. In the distance, he could see a shape moving, bounding through the darkness toward him. It was faster than anything he'd ever seen. Too fast for a human, too large for an animal. Panicked, Jake stumbled over the rocks and scrub, breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced back, and in the brief flash of his dying flashlight, he saw it. Something between a man and a beast, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was closing in. Jake pushed forward, barely able to think through the terror. He could hear the thing's footsteps now, faster and faster, like it was playing with him. His legs burned, but he couldn't stop. Up ahead, he saw an abandoned cabin, half buried in the sand. Without thinking, he dashed inside, slamming the door behind him. The thing circled the cabin, scratching at the walls, its footsteps heavy on the roof. Jake pressed his back against the door, trying to catch his breath. The night was filled with the sound of claws scraping wood, of whispers in a language he couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. For a long time, Jake sat in silence, waiting, barely daring to breathe. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, he slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The desert was still, the tracks leading away into the distance. Whatever it was gone, for now. But as Jake made his way back to town, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Something ancient and evil lingered in the shadows of Red Mesa, and it wasn't finished with him yet. That night, Jake sat at the dinner table again, this time in silence. He had told his uncle everything. Henry, though unsurprised, looked grave. "You shouldn't have gone out there, Jake. This thing doesn't just stop. Once it's chosen you—" Jake interrupted, trying to hide the panic rising in his chest. "So what? What do I do?" Henry leaned forward, his voice low and trembling. "Leave, Jake. Pack your things and leave town tonight." Jake didn't waste time. Before the sun fully set, he had thrown his belongings into his truck and started the engine. As he drove out of Red Mesa, he looked into the rearview mirror, watching the town disappear behind him. But just as the last house faded from view, his breath caught in his throat. In the mirror, standing in the middle of the road, was the same figure from the night before. It was tall, still, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural glow. This time, it wasn't running. It was waiting. For him. Jake slammed on the gas, speeding into the dark desert night. But deep down, he knew there was no outrunning it. It had chosen him, and now it would follow, always waiting, watching, until it finally made its move. And when it did, Jake wouldn't be ready. The rugged peaks of northern New Mexico rose against the fading sky, a remote paradise where Emma and her friends had planned a peaceful weekend getaway. The group had been excited to escape the daily grind, hiking deep into the Carson National Forest along the Williams Lake Trail. Their destination was a secluded campsite near the tree line, where they would spend the next few days hiking, exploring, and relaxing. Emma, along with her friends, Jason, Matt, and Sarah, felt the weight of the outside world fall away as they set up camp. The late afternoon sun dipped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The day had been perfect, but as night fell, the atmosphere began to change. After dinner, they gathered around a crackling fire, enjoying the isolation. The silence of the forest was peaceful at first, but slowly it turned oppressive. The usual sounds of wildlife, crickets, rustling leaves, seemed to vanish all at once, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Did anyone hear that?" Jason asked, breaking the uneasy silence. His voice was barely a whisper. Emma frowned. She hadn't heard anything, but there was something about Jason's tone that set her on edge. They all fell silent, listening closely. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a low, almost melodic whistle drifted from the darkness beyond their camp, a sound that wasn't quite like the wind, yet not fully human either. "Probably just an animal," Matt said, though his voice lacked confidence. But then the whistle came again, louder this time, followed by something else, an eerie cry that echoed through the trees, cutting through the stillness like a jagged knife. It was a sound Emma had never heard before, something primal and unnatural. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jason stood abruptly, shining his flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. The beam swept through the trees, revealing only shadows. He lingered on a particular spot just beyond the firelight. "Did you guys see that?" Jason asked, his voice rising. Before anyone could respond, Emma saw it too, a figure moving unnaturally fast between the trees, there one moment and gone the next. It was dark, almost like a shadow, but there was something wrong about it. Its movements were jerky, inhuman. Without thinking, Matt leaped to his feet and sprinted toward the figure. "Matt, no!" Emma shouted, but he was already gone, crashing through the underbrush. The others jumped up, panic surging through the group. "What is he doing?" Sarah gasped, grabbing Emma's arm. Jason pointed his flashlight toward the trail Matt had taken, but it was useless. The forest swallowed him whole. The sound of Matt's footsteps quickly faded, and soon there was only silence again. Emma's heart pounded as she strained to hear something, anything from the woods. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the darkness, a high-pitched scream. It was Matt. "We have to go after him," Emma said, her voice trembling. "He's in trouble." Jason nodded, already grabbing his pack and a flashlight. The three of them hurried after Matt, following the direction of the scream. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, the thick trees blotting out the moonlight, leaving them in near-total darkness. The strange whistling sound returned, this time closer, circling them as if the forest itself was alive. Jason led the way, his flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. "Matt!" he shouted, his voice desperate. But there was no answer, just the eerie sounds of the forest. They ran deeper into the woods, the trail disappearing beneath their feet. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, fear tightening around her like a vice. The night seemed to press in on them, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a branch, made her flinch. Then, out of nowhere, they found him, Matt, standing in the middle of a small clearing, his back to them. He was unnaturally still, facing the tree line. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood up. "Matt?" Jason called, cautiously approaching. Matt didn't respond. "Something's wrong," Emma whispered, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. Jason edged closer and reached out to touch Matt's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Matt's head jerked around, his eyes wide and glassy. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was a raspy, distorted voice, mimicking Matt's tone but wrong. Horribly wrong. "Help me!" Matt's voice echoed, though his lips barely moved. Emma's blood ran cold. That wasn't Matt. Whatever stood in front of them was wearing his face, but it wasn't him. Jason stumbled back in horror as the figure twisted unnaturally, its limbs cracking and contorting. The Matt figure let out a guttural growl before it bolted into the woods with inhuman speed, disappearing into the night. "We have to get out of here," Jason gasped, backing away from the clearing. "That wasn't him." Emma nodded, her mind racing. They had to go back to camp, pack up and leave before whatever was out there found them again. They turned and sprinted through the forest, the trees blurring past as panic drove them forward. But as they ran, the sounds of the whistling and growling followed them, always just behind, as though something was hunting them, herding them deeper into the woods. By the time they reached the camp, everything felt wrong. Their tents were torn open and strange animal-like tracks surrounded the area. Sarah collapsed near the fire, sobbing. "What is happening?" Before anyone could respond, the forest fell silent again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she looked toward the trees. She could feel it. The thing that had taken Matt was watching them, waiting for its moment. "We need to leave now," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. She grabbed her backpack and started packing, her hands shaking. Just as they were about to leave, The figure reappeared at the edge of the clearing, standing unnaturally still, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It no longer looked like Matt, but something far more sinister, something ancient and malevolent, wearing a grotesque, twisted version of his face. Without a word, the three of them bolted, fleeing into the dark woods. The creature's footsteps followed closely behind, its low growl echoing through the night. Emma's lungs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, but she knew they couldn't outrun it forever. They stumbled onto a narrow mountain trail, but the creature was relentless. It lunged at them from the shadows, forcing them to fight for their lives. Jason swung a heavy branch at it, but it barely slowed the thing down. It was playing with them, toying with its prey. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The creature stopped just at the tree line, watching as they collapsed onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. They had escaped, for now. But Emma knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with them. Not yet. The mountains of New Mexico held many secrets, and they had barely scratched the surface. Tony had been driving trucks for 5 years, and the desert nights of Arizona never bothered him before. He was used to the solitude, the vast emptiness of the landscape, and the endless stretch of highway illuminated only by his headlights. But tonight was different. It was well past midnight, and Tony was hauling a load of machinery across the long, desolate Route 66, heading toward a delivery in Flagstaff. The desert was quiet, almost too quiet. His truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the barren expanse of sand and rock. The radio crackled with static, every station fading in and out of range. As he drove, Tony began to notice shadows flickering at the edge of his vision, quick, darting movements just beyond the reach of his lights. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. He was tired, and the monotony of the road often played tricks on his mind. But then, he saw it, clear as day. A figure ran across the highway, a shadowy blur moving too fast to be human. Tony slammed on the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. The truck screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the asphalt. He sat there for a moment, staring out into the darkness, his breathing heavy. "Did I just see that?" he muttered to himself, hands gripping the steering wheel. He flicked on his high beams and scanned the road ahead. Nothing. The desert stretched on, empty and still. Tony let out a shaky breath and rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept in nearly 20 hours. It was probably just a coyote, or maybe the fatigue messing with his head. But as he started the truck again and drove on, that uneasy feeling lingered. Something wasn't right. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The radio crackled again, this time with a strange rhythmic static. It almost sounded like whispering. Tony glanced at the radio, confused. He fiddled with the dial, but no matter what station he tuned to, the whispering remained. A chill ran down his spine. He reached over and shut the radio off, but the whispering didn't stop. Now it was inside the truck, faint but unmistakable. Voices, speaking in a language he didn't understand. The shadows returned, darting across the road in front of him, flickering in and out of his peripheral vision. Tony's pulse quickened. Something was out there, watching him. Up ahead, the faint glow of an old neon sign appeared on the horizon. A rundown motel, abandoned for years, its sign flickering like a ghost from a forgotten era. The parking lot was empty, and the building was half collapsed. But Tony felt an overwhelming need to stop. He needed to rest, if only for a few hours. He pulled the truck into the lot, the tires crunching over the gravel. The desert wind howled around him as he stepped out of the cab, the sound eerily like a voice calling his name. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Just the wind, he told himself, nothing more. Tony approached the dilapidated motel, the broken windows dark and hollow like empty eye sockets. As he stepped inside the dusty lobby, the temperature seemed to drop, and a sense of unease settled over him like a heavy blanket. The place was deserted, but something about it felt wrong, like he wasn't alone. Ignoring the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, Tony found an old, weathered armchair and sat down, rubbing his eyes. He'd rest for a bit, just until the sun started to rise. He could keep driving after that. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the whispering returned, louder this time, closer. His head snapped up, and his eyes darted around the room. He could have sworn he saw movement in the shadows near the door, a figure standing there watching him. "Hello?" he called, his voice hoarse. No answer. The figure moved closer, and Tony's heart raced. It looked human, but its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, like it didn't quite belong in its own skin. Panicking, Tony bolted from the chair and ran out of the motel, scrambling back into his truck. His hands shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and he floored it, speeding out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. But as he drove, the shadows followed him. In the rearview mirror, he saw them, figures running alongside the truck, their limbs distorted, faces twisted into unnatural shapes. One of them, larger than the rest, was keeping pace with the truck, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. Tony pressed harder on the gas, the truck's engine roaring as he sped through the desert night. His heart pounded in his chest as the whispering filled the cab again, louder now, almost as if it was coming from the figures outside. He glanced at the road ahead and saw another figure standing in the middle of the highway, directly in his path. It was too late to swerve. The truck barreled toward the figure, but just as it was about to collide, the figure vanished. Tony gasped, gripping the wheel as he tried to regain control of the truck, his pulse racing. The radio suddenly crackled to life, and a voice, deep and distorted, whispered his name. "Tony." His stomach dropped. Whatever this thing was, it knew him. It had been watching him. Up ahead, he saw a narrow, winding road that cut through a canyon. Without thinking, he swerved onto it, desperate to lose whatever was following him. The truck careened down the winding road, the steep cliffs rising on either side, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The whispering grew louder, filling his head with strange, twisted words. Then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. The thing chasing him had changed. No longer just a shadow, it had taken on a shape, a form that was almost human but wrong in every way. Its eyes glowed bright yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was a skinwalker. Tony had heard stories from other truckers, tales of creatures from Navajo legend that could change shape, mimic voices, and hunt people in the night. He never believed them, not until now. The skinwalker was getting closer, its twisted limbs moving at an unnatural speed, its eyes locked on him. Tony's heart pounded in his chest as he floored the gas, trying to outrun it, but the road was narrow, the canyon walls pressing in on either side. Suddenly, the truck hit a sharp turn, and the back wheels skidded, sending the truck sliding dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Tony fought to regain control, his hands slick with sweat, the skinwalker's growls echoing in his ears. Just as the truck began to tip, the skinwalker lunged at the window, its hand slamming against the glass with a sickening thud. Tony screamed, jerking the wheel hard to the left, sending the truck back onto the road. He glanced at the mirror again, but the creature was gone. The whispering had stopped. The desert was silent once more. Tony drove through the night, not daring to stop until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. When he finally pulled into a gas station just outside Flagstaff, he stumbled out of the truck, his hands still shaking. He glanced back at the road, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him from the distance. But there was nothing, just the empty desert stretching on forever.